The European Parliament has refused for now to grant China market economy status in the World Trade Organization. Many lawmakers there oppose it, in part because they consider Chinese steel production a threat to European jobs. China joined the World Trade Organization in 2001 with the belief it might be granted market economy status by the end of the year. For Europe's second largest trading partner, membership would make it easier to export goods to the European Union's 28-member bloc.
We hope that the European side can adopt an objective view towards China's development and respect the rule of the game of the World Trade Organization and respect the judicial obligation provided for in international documents. Our two parties always promote a spirit of openness, liberty, free exchange, honesty, and the rule of law.
Joining us now from Beijing is Xu Sitao. He's the chief economist for the financial consulting group Deloitte China. With us from London is Keiyu Jin. She's a professor of economics at the London School of Economics. Also with us from Brussels is Duncan Freeman. He's a senior research fellow at the Brussels Diplomatic Academy and the Brussels Academy for Chinese and European Studies. And with us in our Washington, D.C. studio is Philippe Lecroix. He's a visiting fellow at the Center on the United States and Europe at the Brookings Institution and the co-author of China's Offensive in Europe. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Xu Sitao, let's start with what is a market economy status and why is it so important to China?
It's important for China because it's really about recognition of China's opening and reform since China's accession into the WTO. So without that recognition, China would have felt somewhat snubbed by Europe. The second reason is really about trade. So without that status, Chinese product would have encountered more resistance in the market, particularly against the backdrop of global economy in such doldrum.
Keiyu Jin, there are already more than 80 countries that recognize China's status as a market economy, and these countries include Russia, Brazil, Singapore, Australia, New Zealand. Why the reluctance on the part of the EU?
I think that some of the countries that you mentioned are, many of them are emerging markets, developing countries. They are embracing more globalization, both on the trade side and the investment side, and we have seen that China has invested recently a lot in Australia. Now, Europe has its own domestic economic issues, and I think one of the domestic pressures is, regarding China's steel industry or these manufacturing industries, which are perceived to be stealing jobs away from European workers themselves. This obviously is a bit of a misperception. One, for the very simple reason that China is actually restructuring its economy away from massive producing industrial goods and manufacturing into more consumer-oriented products and services. And this is actually where a greater openness and greater trade between Europe and China can help both countries. Now, the turning protectionist kind of trend, we've seen that in the political debate in the US, and unfortunately Europe is moving towards that as well in responding to some of its economic issues, but actually this is, if anything, it would exacerbate the European economic problems by not embracing China in a more global economy.
Duncan, the European Parliament has passed a non-binding resolution to call on the European Commission, that's the executive branch of the EU, not to grant market economy status to China. And lawmakers have been expressing their concerns about EU industry, about jobs. So is this debate in part about jobs here?
Well, I think in Brussels, certainly it is very much about jobs, and it's about concerns in certain countries and certain sectors which are seen by their constituency as being under threat from China, from competition from China. But it's also important to remember that this is not something which affects all trade between the EU and China. It only affects a very small percentage of trade between the EU and China. The percentage of trade which is subject potentially to anti-dumping duties, which is generally less than 2% of EU imports from China. So it is actually a big political issue, but in the wider context of the EU-China trading relationship, it only affects a small part of the trade.
Philip, you've written extensively about Chinese investments in your book, China's Offensive in Europe. What makes Europe so attractive for Chinese investors?
Well, Europe has a lot of brands for a start, and technology, and Europe is a market, and that's where it's bringing us back to this subject. China has launched a sort of going out policy in the late 90s and encouraged state-owned enterprises to, and also private companies to invest in Europe, and it's worked quite well in terms of numbers, and last year was a jump of 44%, for example. So China is certainly interested in developing a strong economic partnership with Europe. Although there are many problems, I must say, including the lack of market access in China itself for European companies. So the debate is somewhat shifting now from a very sort of China-friendly Europe to a more sort of mixed attitude. And I think the European Parliament vote reflects this, as 80% of the MEPs who are democratically elected by Europeans decided to go against this market economy status. And I have to say, when I look at the EU definition of a non-market economy, it says that one of the criteria involves a low degree of governmental influence over the allocation and resources and decisions of enterprises, which is probably not a criteria for Chinese state-owned enterprises, in particular when they do business with the rest of the world. So that all these kind of things, and including the fact 70% of the Chinese FDIs in Europe are state-owned and backed by state banks and sovereign funds. All this is somewhat worrying to a number of European politicians.
Xu Sitao, there are at least 3 European countries, France, Spain, and Italy, of course all members of the European Union, who say that giving China this status, a market economy status, will result in Europe being flooded with cheap goods. Is that a valid concern?
Not really, but in the short term, I do think in certain European countries they are quite worried about China's steel industry, which is being plagued by overcapacity. So if you look at China's export of steel in past 2 years, we have seen this surge of export volume. At the same time, the value of exports actually went down. So that was the argument, I think, used by many European countries because on the ground of anti-dumping. So, I mean, steel industry is always very sensitive in Europe. If you understand the history of European Union starting after World War II. So this is a particularly sensitive area. But I don't think you can use a sweeping statement to describe many other industries.
Keijun, there are critics of this. They're like industrial lobbyists, trades unions, and they complain that China uses government subsidies to support exports, and that undermines overseas competition. What do you make of those complaints?
Well, I think it is to some degree true, although the intention originally was not completely deliberate. The Chinese model so far since the 1980s has been about industrialization because there is a mental bias that industrialization is tantamount to modernization. So subsidizing the firms with cheap labor and cheap capital obviously gives these firms a head start in terms of exporting cheap goods, but actually the entity that's the agents who are actually subsidizing these firms are not really the government. It comes down to the households because the households are earning almost zero on their savings, and also they are the ones who supply labor, and wages have not been climbing as rapidly as their productivity. So I think conceptually it's just part of the Chinese growth model in terms of letting firms and production and investment thrive at the cost of consumption. intervention. Now, it's not a deliberate strategy for the government to directly subsidize firms, Chinese firms, to export abroad. I think that would be a misinterpretation, although that is partly true. Of course, China has many other things, let's keep in mind, not just cheap labor, not just cheap capital, but also fantastic infrastructure, human resources. Compared to a lot of developing countries, it does have a natural comparative advantage. So I think to some degree, it's a mixture of both. But as I was emphasizing a little bit earlier, China is restructuring. This is a very clear strategy, and it would be a mistake not to embrace China in the new economic model in terms of synergies between technology, capital, and brands. This is where Europe would stand a great chance.
Right, Philippe?
Well, I'm afraid. I mean, China is really clearly not a market economy at the moment. All the figures and all the signs, every economist agree that there's not enough economic freedom for private businesses. On the other hand, if you look at things from a European point of view, we're talking about 200,000 jobs at stake in the steel industry. And Europe is facing many problems, economic, social, political, elections coming up, that's also a factor. But surely nobody wants to see 200,000 jobs disappearing, including in the UK, which is facing a general election, a referendum on the EU very soon. So it's a debate that unfortunately will have to be solved in a different way, not by granting the market economy status, perhaps using mitigating measures, or perhaps not granting the market economy status to China. But I don't think it's going to happen this year. I mean, the European Parliament vote, it was very clear. The final vote will be as clear as we saw a couple of weeks ago. And I think whatever the European Commission might say, the politics will actually decide in the end.
Duncan, at the...
Could I just jump in?
Sorry. Go ahead, Kay.
Sorry. Just one about the market economy. Now, there are two issues. First of all, there's state capitalism. Now, I think that certain countries, such as Singapore, such as China, will remain to operate under state capitalist mode. Not every country has to have the same kind of market economy. Singapore has never been part of this debate. Now, if a market economy is about very little government intervention, we certainly cannot say that about Europe, or to some degree the US either. So I think we have to come to the terms that good trading partners, great trading partners, something that would have a win-win situation for both sides, will have to be more tolerant in terms of what kind of economic scheme under which it operates. And so I would beg to say that, beg to differ in terms of saying that a lot of the prices are revealing huge market dynamics in China. Certain kind of government subsidies here and there in different industries happen across all around the world. But I would go far to say that Chinese market economy in many sectors, many industries, both domestically and internationally, really symbolize a very free market economy. The prices will reveal many things. So I think we have to slightly question and not sweep under the rug, what do we really mean by market economy? Because if it's all about government intervention, that would apply to a lot of other countries.
Right, all a question of definition. Duncan, you wanted to say something.
Well, I was just going to say something quite similar, that I think we shouldn't be too focused simply on the words market economy status, which can lead us into endless, rather philosophical debates about what exactly is a market economy, which don't deal with what is actually an essentially political problem. And I think even in the European Parliament, although the vote was saying that at the present moment China should not have market economy status, in fact, it was leaving quite a lot of wriggle room for the Commission to find a solution, because what it also said was that any solution would have to be WTO compliant. And there is a possibility, and a quite serious one, that under the WTO, China would get its status as a non-market economy removed at the end of this year. And so the European Union would have to deal with that situation where the WTO considers effectively China to be a market economy, and the solution that the EU would have to come up with would have to be compliant with that. Otherwise, and it's quite clear that this would probably happen, China will directly challenge the European Union at the WTO and has a reasonable chance, probably, of winning its case. And so that is a serious political problem that the European Union and China together have to solve.